May 14th, 1969, Cedar Valley, Oregon. 17-year-old Anna Whitfield left the town library at 8:45 p.m. She never made it home. At 9:15, a couple walking along a wooded trail found her red bicycle thrown to the ground. No Anna, no struggle. Just an empty road fading into the dark. Police arrived quickly. They searched the woods, the riverbank, the trails. Hundreds of volunteers joined in. But there were no footprints, no torn clothes, no clues that told them where she had gone. For weeks the town lived in fear. Doors locked early. Parents walked their children to school. Flyers with Anna's face were taped to every storefront. Reporters called it Oregon's most shocking disappearance of the decade. The only piece of evidence came from the riverbank. A torn sweater, soaked and frayed. In 1969, there was nothing investigators could do with it. No DNA, no databases, no way to test what it carried. The case went cold. Decades passed. Anna's family held memorials, never with a body to bury. Every new detective who reopened the file found the same dead ends. Until 2025. In an old evidence box, the sweater was tested again. This time, science spoke. A hidden trace of blood, a strand of DNA, and a name that had lived in Cedar Valley all along. 56 years after Anna disappeared, investigators uncovered the truth. She had been taken. She had been silenced. And the man responsible had walked freely through the town for years. This is the story of Anna Whitfield, the night she vanished, the investigation that failed her, and the breakthrough that finally revealed what really happened on that dark road in 1969. Anna Whitfield was born in 1952 in Cedar Valley, Oregon. She was the only child of William and Grace Whitfield. Her family lived a modest life in a small wood-framed house on the edge of town. Her father worked long hours as a carpenter in a local lumber mill. Her mother took sewing jobs for neighbors to bring in extra money. The Whitfields belonged to the working class. They did not have much, but they valued discipline, hard work, and education. Cedar Valley in the 1960s was a quiet place, a town of just over 3,000 residents surrounded by farmland and forest. It was the kind of community where people left their doors unlocked. Crime was rare. Families knew one another by name. News traveled quickly, but few events ever made the front page of regional newspapers. Anna's father, William, was strict but devoted. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, serious, and always occupied with woodwork. He often repaired Anna's red bicycle, the one she rode to the library. He kept it in good condition, tightening bolts, fixing the chain, oiling the pedals. That bicycle was his way of giving her freedom while ensuring her safety. It was also the bicycle that later became the last physical trace of her before she vanished. Grace, Anna's mother, balanced the household. She was gentle, patient, and spent long evenings hunched over a sewing machine. She altered coats, hemmed pants, and patched shirts for neighbors. The money she earned often went toward Anna's school supplies. She was known as someone who encouraged her daughter to pursue education, even if the family could barely afford it. Grace's bond with Anna was strong. She was protective, but she also gave Anna space to study and dream. Anna was 17 in the spring of 1969. Friends described her as quiet, polite, and diligent. She was not the most popular girl in school, but her ambition was clear. She wanted to become a literature teacher. She told her teachers that one day she would stand in front of a classroom and share her love of books. It was not a dream of fame or wealth. It was a simple, steady goal: teaching. That dream reflected the kind of person she was: modest, consistent, and grounded. Anna's life followed a predictable rhythm. After school, she often went straight to the public library. The library was only a 15-minute bike ride from her home. She sat at the same corner table, surrounded by stacks of books. When exam season came, she stayed longer than usual, copying notes, reading assignments, and preparing. Her route home was familiar: down Main Street, past the church, and along a dirt trail leading toward the family's neighborhood. It was a routine known by family, friends, and neighbors. Anna was not rebellious. She did not have conflicts at home. She did not date anyone seriously. Police later confirmed that she had no history of arguments with her parents, no secret plans, no evidence of running away. Her teachers called her reliable. Her friends said she was trustworthy. This profile made her disappearance even harder to understand. In Cedar Valley, people saw Anna as the daughter of the town. She was respectful to elders, polite to shopkeepers, and kind to younger children. Neighbors recalled her helping carry groceries, holding doors and saying "thank you" in a soft but firm tone. There was nothing about her life that suggested danger. She was a typical teenager in a quiet Oregon town. On the evening of May 14, 1969, Anna followed her usual pattern. She ate dinner at home with her parents. At 7:30, she told her mother she would head to the library to study. She wore a simple light blouse, a cardigan, and jeans. She rode her red bicycle, the same one her father had maintained. She promised to return by 9. Her parents did. At 8:45, a local resident, Harold Simmons, saw Anna leaving the library. She carried her notebook, placed it in the bicycle basket, and pedaled into the night. She was calm, steady, and showed no sign of distress. That was the last verified sighting of her alive. Half an hour later, at 9:15, a couple named John and Linda Palmer walked along the dirt trail. They noticed a red bicycle lying on its side. The chain had slipped off. The handlebars were twisted. But there was no sign of Anna, no belongings scattered nearby. The Palmers thought it was strange, but not alarming. They assumed the girl had walked home. When the bicycle was still there hours later, abandoned, concern grew. That abandoned bicycle became the center of the mystery. It marked the spot where her trail ended. A 17-year-old girl vanished between the library and her home, a distance of less than 2 miles. In a town as small as Cedar Valley, through familiar faces and quiet streets, such a disappearance was almost unthinkable. Her parents reacted immediately. When Anna did not return home by 9:30, her mother began to worry. By 10 o'clock, her father was outside searching along the streets. By midnight, neighbors joined. By morning, the police were notified, and the search for Anna officially began. The background of Anna's life mattered in every stage of the investigation. Detectives had to consider every possibility. Did she run away? No evidence. Did she plan to meet someone? No phone calls, no letters, no notes. Did she have enemies? None that anyone could name. The very ordinariness of her life made the case even more difficult. Investigators combed through her school records, her notebooks, and her library activity. They found only evidence of a hard-working student. They interviewed classmates, teachers. They interviewed her parents and relatives. Nothing suggested she wanted to disappear. The timeline was brutally simple. She left home at 7:30. Arrived at the community felt the loss immediately. Anna had been a familiar face. Her disappearance struck fear in a place that rarely knew violence. Parents began escorting their children to and from school. Women avoided walking alone after dark. For Cedar Valley, life changed overnight. Every detail of her life, from her father's careful maintenance of her bicycle to her mother's preserved box of mementos, became evidence decades later. The red bicycle was impounded. The torn cardigan found near the river was stored. Her notebook, recovered from the bicycle basket, was examined. None of it in 1969 could be connected to a suspect. The science did not exist. But the background mattered, because when investigators reopened the case more than 50 years later, these ordinary details, her habits, her patterns, her predictable life, became the very foundation for solving it. The fact that she was regular, reliable, and predictable meant that her disappearance could not be explained as voluntary. It was not a choice. It was a crime. For Anna Whitfield, her life was brief. 17 years in a small Oregon town. Her background, her family, her routines, they all pointed to a young woman with promise, a young woman with plans. But on May 14, 1969, those plans ended. And what remained was an empty bicycle, a torn cardigan, and a family that waited for decades for answers. May 14, 1969, Cedar Valley, Oregon. A small town where people locked their doors only at night, and where every face was familiar. That evening, the Whitfield family expected nothing unusual. Their daughter, Anna, was at the public library preparing for her final exams. She had been there many times before. At exactly 8:45 p.m., a man named Harold Simmons walked out of the library and noticed Anna. She was pushing open the glass door with her left hand, balancing a stack of books and her small notebook in the other. He saw her step onto the sidewalk, unlock her red bicycle, and ride off toward Main Street. She pedaled slowly, her long hair tied back, the same way she had done hundreds of times. For Harold, it was such an ordinary sight that he never imagined it would become the last confirmed moment of Anna's life. The ride home was short, 2 miles. The path took her past the town's main street, the church with its old bell tower, and then into a narrow dirt road that cut through the trees toward her family's home. On that spring night, the streets were nearly empty. A few shopkeepers were closing. Porch lights flickered on. The sky was already darkening, though the air was still mild. At 9:15 p.m., half an hour later, a young couple named John and Linda Palmer walked along the same dirt path. They weren't looking for anything. They were taking their usual evening walk. But what they found changed everything. Lying on the side of the path was Anna's bicycle. The red frame leaned awkwardly, the handlebars turned sideways, the front wheel spinning slightly. The chain had slipped off the gear. The bike looked as if it had been dropped suddenly, not parked. John crouched down, inspecting it. There was no sign of damage, no blood, no torn grass or dirt kicked up from a struggle. Linda looked around. The woods on both sides were By midnight, Anna was still missing. Grace's worry turned to panic. The Whitfields called the Cedar Valley Police Department. The officer on duty listened to their report, but his initial response was cautious. "Teenagers sometimes ran away," he said. Maybe Anna had decided to leave for reasons her parents didn't know. It was a common assumption in those years, especially when no crime scene was obvious. The Whitfields immediately rejected that theory. Their daughter had no boyfriend, no history of conflict, No reason to disappear voluntarily. She had been preparing for exams. She was supposed to come home that night, as she always did. For William and Grace, the idea of her running away made no sense. But the police logged the report and promised to check the roads in the morning. Word spread quickly. By 1 a.m., neighbors had joined the search. Men carried flashlights and lanterns. A few brought dogs. They walked the dirt paths, the riverbank, and the wooded trails surrounding the town. Cars drove slowly with headlights scanning the fields. Every call of her name vanished into the night with no reply. What they found, hours later, became the first piece of evidence. Near the edge of the Cedar River, about half a mile from where the bicycle had been discovered, a deputy noticed a piece of clothing tangled in the reed. It was a torn sweater, a cream-colored knit garment, ripped along the sleeve. Grace later identified it as Anna's, but in 1969, the sweater provided no answers. There was no DNA testing, no forensic fiber analysis. The only conclusion the investigators could draw was that Anna had likely passed through that area. Whether she had been pulled there or dropped it herself, they could not tell. The bicycle and the sweater, that was all they had. By dawn, the entire town knew. Cedar Valley, a quiet community of just 3,000 residents, was awake and on edge. The timeline was painfully simple. At 8:45 p.m., Anna rode away from the library. By 9:15 p.m., her bicycle was abandoned. Somewhere in that 30-minute gap, she vanished. No screams, no witnesses, no sign of a fight. A girl disappeared into thin air, and the only trace left was her bike lying on the ground. Theories formed quickly. Some officers suggested she might have slipped into the river, but the banks showed no tracks, no drag marks, no disturbance. Divers searched anyway. They found nothing. Others thought she might have accepted a ride from someone she trusted, a friend, a neighbor, maybe even a teacher. But no one admitted to seeing her after she left the library. Grace clutched Anna's sweater in her hands as the search teams combed the woods. William retraced the path again and again, hoping to see something everyone else had missed. But each pass ended in silence. The Palmers, who had first seen the bicycle, came forward and gave their statement. They described exactly how the bike looked, how nothing around it seemed unusual, and how they assumed Anna had simply walked away. Investigators pressed them. Was anyone else nearby? Did they hear a car? Did they notice headlights? But the Palmers insisted the night was still. No engine sounds, no footsteps. Just the bike. This lack of evidence made the case even harder. In most abductions, signs are clear. Broken branches, footprints, dropped belongings. In Anna's case, the scene was too clean, almost staged, as though whoever was responsible had planned every step. That night, Cedar Valley changed. The townspeople who once left doors unlocked began bolting them. Parents who once let children roam the streets now kept them close. And the Whitfields, standing in their kitchen surrounded by searchers, faced the first long night without their daughter. As the days passed, the trail grew colder. Reporters swarmed the town. Headlines called it the most. In the end, part 3 of Anna's story is defined by silence. Silence on the road where she should have been riding. Silence in the woods where her voice was never heard. Silence at the riverbank where her torn sweater lay. A teenager set out on a short, ordinary ride home. 30 minutes later, only her bicycle remained, and Cedar Valley was left with questions that no one could answer. May 14th, 1969. Midnight struck in Cedar Valley. By then, Anna Whitfield had been gone for more than 3 hours. Her bicycle had been found abandoned on the dirt trail, but there was no sign of Anna. Her parents, William and Grace, could no longer wait. At 12:05 a.m., they walked into the small Cedar Valley police station and officially reported their 17-year-old daughter missing. The duty officer on shift took down the report. He wrote the details in a thin logbook. Female, white, 17. Last seen leaving the town library at 8:45 p.m., traveling home on a red bicycle. His first note was routine. Possible runaway. That was the common approach at the time. When a teenager vanished, the initial assumption was that she had chosen to leave. The Whitfields refused to accept that. William insisted Anna was responsible. She had no money with her, no overnight bag, and no reason to disappear. Grace was shaking as she repeated that Anna had gone to the library to prepare for exams, not to run away. The officer noted their statements, but still treated the case as low priority. By 12:30 a.m., a few patrol officers were dispatched to check the trail again. They carried flashlights, their beams cutting narrow circles into the night. The search was slow. The ground was uneven, the trees thick, the river running dark just beyond the path. No footprints, no broken branches. Nothing suggested a struggle. All they had was the red bicycle, leaning on its side, the chain slipped off. Neighbors joined the search before dawn. Men arrived. The first step was to gather witness statements. The last confirmed sighting came from Harold Simmons, a local farmer. He told officers that at 8:45 p.m. he left the library after returning a book. He saw Anna climb onto her bicycle and pedal away, heading down Main Street. She had a small notebook tucked in her basket. Nothing seemed unusual. She didn't appear upset or hurried. The second testimony came from John and Linda Palmer, a young couple walking near the trail. At about 9:15 p.m., they spotted the bicycle lying on the ground. The front wheel was turned sideways. The chain had come loose. They didn't see Anna. They didn't hear anything. The Palmers assumed the bike had been left temporarily and moved on. They thought nothing of it until news of the disappearance spread. The lack of additional witnesses was troubling. Cedar Valley was small, but the road between the library and the Whitfield home passed through the center of town. Someone should have seen Anna. Yet beyond Harold Simmons and the Palmers, no one came forward. By the afternoon of May 15th, the investigation intensified. The sheriff's deputies and FBI agents organized a grid search. More than 100 volunteers joined. They combed through forested areas, checked barns and sheds, and dragged sections of the Cedar River. Officers walked shoulder to shoulder across fields, calling Anna's name. Helicopters were requested but denied. Rural Oregon in 1969 lacked resources. The only discovery came late that evening. A torn sweater lying near the riverbank, half buried under leaves. It appeared to be Anna's. The Whitfields confirmed it resembled the garment she had worn. But in 1969, forensic science was limited. No DNA testing, no fiber comparison databases. The sweater was photographed, placed in a paper bag, and stored in the evidence room. To investigators, it was a clue without context, important but impossible to decode. The FBI interviewed known troublemakers in town. One man, Richard Cole, a 26-year-old mechanic, was quietly noted in their files. He had a reputation for drinking and following young women. But with no witnesses, no confession, and no physical evidence tying him to Anna, agents had no grounds to detain him. He denied involvement, and the search moved on. As hours turned into days, the case grew colder. Posters went up on shop windows and church boards. Photographs of Anna, her school portrait with long brown hair tied back, were printed on flyers. Residents pinned them to fences, telephone poles, and gas station pumps. Cedar Valley was small. The news traveled fast. Within 48 hours, everyone knew a high school girl had vanished without a sound. Reporters arrived from Portland. Newspapers ran headlines. "Teen girl missing in Cedar Valley." Some papers hinted at scandal, suggesting Anna had run away with a boyfriend. The Whitfields rejected these claims. Grace appeared. The case stagnated. By early June 1969, FBI involvement slowed. Without evidence of interstate kidnapping, their role was limited. The sheriff's office scaled back manpower. Only a few local officers continued to check tips. Most were dead ends, false sightings, prank calls, or vague stories from drifters. For the Whitfields, the silence was unbearable. Every day without news deepened the wound. William patrolled the trail himself at night, flashlight in hand, searching for any overlooked sign. Grace kept Anna's room untouched, her books stacked neatly, her bed made. The town began to change. Parents stopped letting children ride bikes alone. Teenagers were warned not to stay out after dark. Church sermons turned into calls for protection and vigilance. Cedar Valley had always felt safe, but now fear hung over it. The disappearance became part of everyday life, mentioned in shops, schools, and Sunday gatherings. By July, official searches ended. The bicycle and sweater were locked away in evidence. Reports were filed and archived. Investigators admitted privately they had nothing. The case had stalled. Yet the impact lingered. Cedar Valley residents remembered the posters, the search lines, the flashlights moving through the trees. They remembered how quickly one ordinary evening turned into a nightmare. They remembered how law enforcement, even with the FBI, could not solve the mystery. The tragedy was sealed by the limits of its time. No cameras on street corners, no cell phone pings, no DNA tests. Investigators worked with flashlights, notebooks, and instinct alone could not reveal what happened in those 30 minutes between 8:45 and 9:15. Within weeks, the investigation reached its bleak conclusion. No suspect, no confession, no recovery of a body. The only certainty was the absence of Anna Whitfield. A 17-year-old student had left the library, ridden her bicycle, and disappeared into a void. By the end of summer 1969, the Whitfield case was officially classified as inactive. Locals called it the trail mystery. Officers referred to it quietly as a cold case. But for the family, it was neither a mystery nor a case file. It was no witnesses saw the moment Anna disappeared. No evidence explained what happened on that trail. And without those answers, the case slid into silence. In just 3 weeks, Anna's disappearance went from breaking news to unanswered question. From a full-scale search to a folder marked inactive. The red bicycle was returned to the Whitfields. The sweater was boxed up and forgotten in an evidence room. And the town of Cedar Valley moved on, outwardly. But inside, the fear never left. For the Whitfield family, the investigation's failure meant living without closure. For the community, it meant a shadow over their reputation as a safe, quiet place. For investigators, it meant frustration, knowing they had reached the edge of their ability. The initial investigation ended not with a solution, but with silence. And that silence would last for 56 years, until science caught up, and truth finally spoke. May 1969. The investigation into the disappearance of Anna Whitfield slowed almost as quickly as it had begun. Within weeks, leads dried up. Witnesses repeated the same small details. Anna leaving the library at 8:45 p.m. Her bicycle abandoned by 9:15 p.m. Beyond that, silence. Police labeled the file inactive. To the Whitfield family, that word felt like a second loss. Throughout the 1970s, William and Grace Whitfield refused to let the case fade. They wrote letters to the Cedar Valley Police Department. They visited the station in person. They asked questions at community meetings. The answers were always the same. There was nothing new to report. Each reply carried the same emptiness. In those first years, Cedar Valley itself kept the memory alive. The town was small, fewer than 4,000 people. News traveled fast, and most families still spoke Anna's name. Local papers ran short follow-up stories, reminding readers that the girl had not. Technology offered no help. In 1984, forensic science was still limited. The torn sweater found near the riverbank sat untouched in an evidence box. No one could test for DNA. It was a piece of fabric, nothing more. Detectives called it a dead lead. Families like the Whitfields called it proof waiting for its time. Grace Whitfield carried that burden alone into the 1990s. She held on to a wooden box filled with her daughter's belongings, books, photographs, and the same sweater preserved by the police but remembered in family photos. She never allowed herself to forget. She gave interviews when reporters asked, standing on her porch answering the same painful questions. "Do you think Anna is still alive?" She never had an answer. In Cedar Valley, the community created a small memorial in front of the library. It was nothing more than a plaque and flowers, but it stood as a reminder. Every student who walked past it knew the story of the girl who had never made it home. The memorial gave the town a place to gather, but it also showed how long the case had remained frozen in time. As the 1990s moved on, the silence grew heavier. New families moved into Cedar Valley. Many had never heard of Anna. Children played in the same fields without knowing a girl had vanished there. The case shifted from living memory to whispered history. Inside the police station, priorities changed. New crimes demanded attention. Anna's file stayed in a cabinet in the basement. Some officers admitted years later that they almost forgot the case even existed. Only a few older residents and the Whitfield family kept her name alive. In 1999, the story reached another painful turn. Grace Whitfield died at the age of 71. She never lived to see the truth. On her final days, she handed her niece, Maggie Whitfield, the responsibility to carry on. Her words were simple. "Don't let them forget Anna." Maggie was only 14. By then, the town had developed a new tradition. Every May, residents held a candlelight vigil for Anna. People gathered in front of the library. They spoke her name, told stories, and reminded the authorities that the case remained unsolved. What began as an act of mourning slowly became a yearly ritual, a reminder of the unanswered questions that defined Cedar Valley. Those vigils grew in size during the late 1990s. News stations from Portland and even Seattle sent crews to cover them. Each year, hope would flare briefly that attention might spark progress. Each year, the candles burned out, and the silence returned. At the start of the 2000s, younger detectives attempted to reopen the file. They reviewed the interviews with Harold Simmons, who had seen Anna leave the library, and the Palmers, who had found her bicycle. They examined the sweater again. But the tools available in 2001 were not yet enough. CODIS, the National DNA Database, was still in its early years. Local departments rarely used it. Cedar Valley's budget was too small. Investigators proposed theories. Some believed Anna had fallen into the river. Others thought she might have run away, despite her family's objections. A few raised the possibility of an abduction. None of these theories could be proven. The evidence simply wasn't there. Without DNA, without cameras, without witnesses, the case stayed frozen. Meanwhile, Cedar Valley itself changed. The 2000 census recorded more residents. Businesses came and went. But the town never shook its unease. Parents warned children not to walk home alone at night. Teenagers whispered Anna's name when they passed the library. For them, the case was a cautionary tale. For the older generation, it was a scar. The decades added layers of dust, both literal and symbolic. By 2015, the evidence box containing Anna's sweater was nearly discarded during an archive cleanup. Only the persistence of... Still, there were people who refused to let it end. Anna Whitfield became the most vocal advocate. She gave interviews, contacted state representatives, and worked with nonprofits focused on missing persons. She carried her aunt's promise forward. To her, Anna was not just a cousin who had vanished. She was a symbol of every family left behind in the dark. The decades of silence took their toll on Cedar Valley. Residents grew wary of strangers. Some never allowed their children out after dusk. Others became suspicious of neighbors. Rumors spread, often without evidence, about who might have been responsible. That climate of fear lingered, long after the crime itself had faded from headlines. In the end, time nearly erased Anna's story. By 2020, only fragments of memory and one fragile evidence box remained. If not for the persistence of a few people, Maggie, local archivists, and determined detectives, the case might have disappeared entirely. The silence lasted more than half a century. From the night Anna left the library in 1969 to the breakthrough in 2025, Cedar Valley waited. Families grieved. Generations passed. Yet the truth remained hidden. The lesson of those years is clear. Without answers, wounds do not heal. Without progress, cases become ghosts. For the Whitfields, silence was as painful as the crime itself. And yet, even after 56 years, silence did not win. Science did. Persistence did. And the small, ordinary details, one sweater, one box, one family's refusal to forget, would one day break the quiet that had held Cedar Valley in its grip for so long. In early 2025, the Oregon State Police launched a statewide initiative to review old cold cases. The goal was simple: identify files that might still contain biological evidence worth testing with modern technology. Detective Karen Miles, a cold case investigator with more than 15 years of experience, was assigned a stack of files from the late 1960s. Among them was a folder marked with a single, faded note: red sweater. Evidence sealed, chain intact. It was the case of Anna Whitfield. The file had been sitting for decades in a metal cabinet, pulled out only during anniversaries or community pressure. The last official review had been in the 1990s, long before DNA databases became powerful tools. Miles read through the original reports, witness statements, sketches of the bicycle's location, and photographs of the wooded trail. Most of it was familiar to anyone who had studied the case, but the note about the red sweater stood out. If it was still sealed, it could be the key. Miles requested the evidence box from the state archives. Weeks later, a battered cardboard container arrived. It was stamped with dates from 1969, 1999, and 2012, each marking a transfer for storage updates. The seal was old, but intact. The logbook showed the sweater had never been opened after the initial collection. Chain of custody was unbroken. That alone was remarkable for a case this old. The box was carried into a controlled forensic lab. Technicians wore protective suits and masks. The package was opened on a sterile bench. Inside was the sweater Anna had been wearing the night she vanished. Time had dulled its color, but stains were still visible. Small brown patches near the cuffs and torso. The technicians photographed it from every angle, measured and weighed it, and logged the details. Pieces of tape were pressed against the fabric. The first step was presumptive testing. A Kastle-Meyer test produced a strong positive reaction. The stain was human blood. A hemotrace kit confirmed it again. Another test for seminal fluid came back negative, ruling out a sexual assault marker but not ruling out violence. The ultraviolet light sweep revealed additional areas where skin cells might have been deposited, especially around the wrists and collar. The sweater was no longer just a relic. It was now an active source of biological evidence. Because the blood was degraded, analysts cut away only a tiny piece, no larger than a pinhead. They ran it through a modern DNA extraction kit designed for low-quantity, fragmented samples. The initial quantification showed only trace amounts, but it was enough to proceed. A mini STR kit was chosen, a specialized method for old and damaged DNA. The samples were amplified carefully, with negative and positive controls included. The scientists repeated the process multiple times to ensure consistency. Aliquots were stored in separate freezers for backup testing. When the results came back, the lab was stunned. A partial but strong male DNA profile had emerged. It showed consistent markers across 18 of 20 loci. The likelihood of contamination was virtually zero. The profile was entered into SODIS, the National DNA Database. Within hours, an automated alert was generated. The name attached to the match was Richard Cole. Cole was no stranger to Cedar Valley. In 1969, he had been a 26-year-old mechanic working at a small garage near Main Street. He had died in 2002 of liver cancer, but before his death, his DNA had been collected in the late 1990s after a felony conviction. That sample had been sitting quietly in SODIS, waiting for a case to trigger it. Now it had. The system flagged the match as high confidence. The report went directly to Detective Miles. It was the first solid lead in the case since, for the first time, investigators could link a person to the crime with hard science. But DNA was only the beginning. Detective Miles began reconstructing Cole's life in the late 1960s. She examined his work schedule at the garage, his known hangouts, and his routes home. Cole often walked or drove near the trail Anna used. Witnesses from that time recalled him loitering outside the library and making young women uncomfortable. He had been questioned in 2 separate assault cases in 1967 and 1968, but neither went to trial. Without DNA or reliable witnesses, prosecutors had nothing. Now, decades later, science had caught up. Miles pulled old business records. In the garage's ledger, she found a note dated May 20th, 1969, less than a week after Anna vanished. Cole had replaced the brakes and cleaned the interior of his truck. It was unusual. He rarely logged such maintenance himself. It suggested he had a reason to cover his tracks. Armed with the DNA hit, investigators sought a search warrant for Cole's former property. Though he had been dead for more than 20 years, the law allowed them to examine locations connected to him. The property now belonged to another family, but they cooperated. Ground-penetrating radar scanned the yard. Dogs trained to detect human remains sniffed the soil. Metal detectors swept the old garage. Behind a wooden wall, in a small hidden space, they found a metal box. Inside were items that froze the room. A silver necklace engraved with the name Anna. A library card dated 1969. A braid of dark hair wrapped in twine. 2 yellowed newspaper clippings about the disappearance. Each item was photographed, bagged, and logged. The necklace was tested. Skin cells on the clasp matched Cole. The interior of the box carried faint traces of DNA from his paternal line. Another lead came from a single gray fiber found on Anna's sweater. When compared to fabric samples stored by Cole's surviving relatives, it matched a blanket once kept in his old truck. Soil samples from the hem of the sweater contained the same mineral composition as dirt from Cole's garage floor. The connections multiplied. The forensic picture grew stronger with every test. DNA from blood on Anna's sweater. Touch DNA from the necklace. Fiber and soil evidence linking her to Cole's vehicle and property. The circumstantial web was now supported by hard science. A panel of independent experts reviewed the findings. They confirmed the chain of custody was intact from 1969 to 2025. They confirmed the scientific methods were valid. And they agreed the probability of error was negligible. The case was presented to the district attorney's office. A grand jury reviewed the evidence, the DNA profile, the physical items, the timeline of Cole's suspicious behavior, and his past accusations. The conclusion was clear. Even without a recovered body, there was enough to classify the case as a homicide and identify Richard Cole as the perpetrator. Had he been alive, prosecutors would have pursued charges. Because he was deceased, the case was closed through what is known as exceptional clearance. Before going public, detectives met privately with Anna's surviving family. Her cousin Margaret, now in her late 60s, was shown the results. For the first time in 56 years, the Whitfield family had an answer. The man who had haunted their community was finally unmasked. Margaret wept as she held the necklace engraved with Anna's name. A press conference followed. Detective Miles stood before cameras and explained the findings. She emphasized that the evidence had been carefully preserved and that without modern DNA technology, the case would have... The story was broadcast across Oregon. Headlines read, DNA links local mechanic to 1969 disappearance of teen. For Cedar Valley, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had come, but only after generations had passed. The breakthrough highlighted 3 lessons. First, the importance of preserving evidence, no matter how old. Second, the power of modern DNA technology, especially mini-STR testing and genealogy. And third, the value of persistence. Investigators who refuse to let a case fade into dust. From a single sweater long forgotten in a warehouse, the truth had emerged. One stain had exposed a predator who hid in plain sight for years. One necklace had proven his connection to Anna. And one community, scarred for decades, could finally speak her name with certainty. The discovery also raised new questions. The hidden box suggested there may have been more victims. The braid of hair was not Anna's. Other items in the collection were not linked to her either. Were there more girls? Were there more unsolved cases tied to Cole? The answers lay ahead in Part 7, when investigators began connecting the dots across the region. But for Part 6, the climax is clear. A red sweater, a drop of blood, and the persistence of science had broken open a case thought to be lost forever. The name Richard Cole was no longer a rumor or a whisper. It was the final word in the disappearance of Anna Whitfield. Richard Cole had always been there. In Cedar Valley, everyone knew the man who fixed their cars. His small garage sat near the center of town, a short walk from the diner and the post office. To most, he was the friendly mechanic who patched flat tires and tuned engines at fair prices. He was polite, even reserved. People waved when they saw him on Main Street. Neighbors recalled him helping push cars out of snowdrifts in the winter. Outwardly, Cole blended in. The night of May 14, 1969, was routine for Cedar Valley. By 9 o'clock, most businesses had closed. But Cole's garage, usually busy until late, had shut its doors unusually early. Records showed he logged off a repair job at 7:30 p.m. A coworker remembered him leaving abruptly, saying he had an errand. After that, no one could confirm where he went. At 8:45, Anna left the library. She was seen by Harold Simmons, a man who later testified that she rode off calmly on her red bicycle. By 9:15, just half an hour later, John and Linda Palmer discovered that same bicycle abandoned on the dirt trail. And sometime in that narrow window, Anna was taken. A woman who lived 2 blocks from the library came forward decades later. Back in 1969, she told police she saw a dark green pickup truck driving slowly past the library that night. She described its rattling muffler and dented fender. To her, it looked like Richard Cole's truck. But investigators dismissed the statement, calling it uncertain and unreliable. Without physical evidence, the detail was ignored. Today, placed alongside the DNA and other findings, it became a crucial piece of the puzzle. Digging deeper, investigators found that Cole's name had surfaced before. In 1967, a teenage girl was attacked while walking home along a wooded path. She fought back and escaped. Her description of the attacker was vague: tall, blonde hair, driving a beat-up pickup. Police interviewed Cole but released him for lack of proof. In 1968, another girl was nearly dragged off a trail not far from Cedar Valley. The attacker fled when headlights approached. She also mentioned a blonde man and an old pickup. Again, Cole was questioned informally. Again, nothing stuck. Those 2 assaults were chillingly close to where Anna disappeared in 1969. They were all within a 3-mile radius of Cole's garage. The new investigation turned to Cole's property. Decades after his death, his old garage and house had passed through multiple owners. With a warrant, detectives searched the crawlspace and outbuildings. Behind a false wooden panel, they uncovered a rusted metal box. Inside lay the kind of items that transformed suspicion into certainty. The box contained a silver necklace engraved with the name Anna. Alongside it were a faded library card in Anna's name, several newspaper clippings about her disappearance, and small trinkets linked to other missing or assaulted girls from the era. Forensic analysis confirmed the necklace's clasp held DNA fragments matching Cole. This discovery aligned perfectly with what investigators already knew about his habits. He didn't just attack. He collected. He kept small trophies, personal reminders of the victims he had stalked. The necklace was undeniable. It belonged to Anna, and it had sat hidden in Cole's possession until the day he died. Patterns grew even clearer when investigators studied how Anna's bicycle was left. It wasn't broken or scattered as if from a struggle. It was propped oddly, chain slipped, like someone had moved it out of the way in a hurry. This matched descriptions from earlier assaults where Cole avoided leaving clear evidence of force. He preferred quick control, silence, and minimal disruption. His behavior after Anna's disappearance also raised red flags. Records from his garage showed he cleaned his truck thoroughly the week following May 14th. A coworker recalled him replacing floor mats and burning old rags. At the time, it seemed like normal maintenance. In hindsight, it suggested an attempt to erase evidence. So why didn't authorities catch him then? The answer lay in the limitations of the 1960s. Without DNA, without security cameras, without digital records, the case depended solely on eyewitness statements. The conclusion was undeniable. Richard Cole had abducted and killed Anna Whitfield. He had hidden in plain sight, a predator shielded by the ordinary face of a small-town mechanic. When news of the findings reached Cedar Valley in 2025, the reaction was visceral. Residents who remembered Cole as a helpful neighbor were stunned. Some had trusted him with their cars. Some had shared drinks with him at the bar. Many struggled to reconcile the image of a man they thought they knew with the reality of a killer who preyed on their daughters. Former classmates of Anna admitted feeling guilt. They remembered the rumors, the unease, the warnings to avoid Cole's truck. They wished they had spoken louder. Witnesses regretted letting their uncertainty silence them. Details dismissed as gossip might have saved lives. For the Whitfield family, the truth was bittersweet. Anna's parents had died decades earlier, never knowing what happened. But her cousin Margaret, now an older woman, finally saw the case resolved. The necklace, recovered from Cole's box, was returned to her. It became both a painful reminder and a symbol of justice, however delayed. The broader lesson for Cedar Valley was sobering. A murderer had lived among them, unnoticed, for years. Protected not by brilliance, but by the silence of an era with limited tools and reluctant voices. What looked like an ordinary man was, in fact, the shadow haunting their community. By connecting these dots, DNA, eyewitness accounts, patterns of assault, hidden trophies, the investigation transformed speculation into fact. The case that baffled a generation had reached its end. Richard Cole, dead for over 2 decades, was named the killer of Anna Whitfield. And yet the story didn't close neatly. The discovery of multiple trophies in Cole's possession suggested other victims whose identities remained unknown. The Whitfield case was solved, but investigators believed Cole's violence stretched for 56 years. That is how long the name Anna Whitfield lived in silence, locked inside a cold case file. For decades, her family asked one question: who took her life? In 2025, the answer finally came. The DNA evidence from a torn sweater led straight to Richard Cole, a man who had lived in Cedar Valley, worked in its garage, and died quietly in 2002. The case was closed at last, but the truth arrived too late for most of the people who needed it most. William Whitfield, Anna's father, passed away in 1984, carrying with him the weight of unanswered questions. Grace, her mother, died in 1999, still holding on to her daughter's belongings inside a wooden box. Neither of them lived to hear the name of the man who destroyed their family. The only one left to witness the ending was Anna's younger cousin, Margaret Maggie Whitfield. Maggie was 14 when Anna disappeared. She had promised her aunt, Grace, that she would not let the world forget. And she kept that promise. When the results came back in 2025, Maggie stood in front of reporters and said, "This doesn't bring Anna back, but it gives us the truth we waited for." Her words marked the close of one of Oregon's longest unsolved mysteries. Maggie did not stop there. Out of tragedy, she created something lasting. She founded the Whitfield Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping families of the missing. The foundation provides support for cold case investigations, funds forensic projects, and offers resources for communities left in the dark. Its mission is simple. No one should wait half a century for answers. The foundation quickly became a symbol of hope across Oregon. It reminded people that even if years pass, justice can still be found. For the people of Cedar Valley, the case was more than a headline. It was part of their lives for decades. What finally solved the mystery was not luck, but science. The breakthrough came from a single piece of evidence: Anna's torn sweater. For decades, it sat in storage, considered useless. In 1969, there was no DNA testing, no modern forensics. But the sweater was preserved, and that made all the difference. In 2025, new DNA analysis revealed a clear match. Richard Cole's genetic profile was in the system, uploaded years earlier from another case. That one connection ended the silence. This case became a lesson in the importance of preserving evidence. Something as ordinary as a piece of fabric, ignored for years, turned out to be the key. Investigators stressed that if even one item is kept, no matter how small, it can one day change everything. Technology advances. Science moves forward. What was invisible in 1969 became undeniable in 2025. The Whitfield case is now taught in training programs for cold case investigators. It is studied as a model of perseverance, how to keep records, how to maintain chain of custody, how to never assume a piece of evidence has no value. It is also a reminder that justice has no expiration date. Even if decades pass, the pursuit of truth must continue. For Cedar Valley, the conclusion brought relief, but also a lasting unease. People realized they had lived alongside a predator. Richard Cole walked their streets, fixed their cars, and disappeared into the crowd. The thought that he kept trophies of his crimes, Anna's necklace, her library card, newspaper clippings, only deepened the shock. The small town that once believed itself safe had to accept that danger had always been part of its past. The emotional impact rippled through generations. Those who were teenagers in 1969 grew old with the mystery unsolved. When the case finally closed, they were grandparents. Many admitted they had built their lives with the shadow of Anna's disappearance hanging. 56 years of silence ended with one DNA match. 56 years of doubt ended with one box of hidden evidence. And 56 years of fear ended with the truth about Richard Cole. The legacy of this case is more than an answer to one family. It is a lesson for every community. Preserve evidence, follow every lead, and never stop asking questions. Because time does not erase the need for justice. The Whitfield Foundation now stands as proof that, even in tragedy, something good can emerge. Families who once felt forgotten now have a place to turn. Investigators now have funding and resources to pursue the cases that were once considered hopeless. Anna's name continues to push others forward, ensuring her story is not lost to history. This is where the story closes, but also where it continues. Cedar Valley finally has peace. The Whitfield family finally has truth. And the world has another reminder of why we must never give up on the missing. If you believe in justice, if you believe in the importance of remembering these stories, share Anna's case. Keep her name alive. And subscribe to this channel for more deep dive investigations into the cases that shaped our communities. Because every time we tell these stories, we remind the world that the missing are never truly gone until the truth is found.